And thanks to the organisers. I think this really is an excellent initiative, and I hope it's only the first of a series. I'd also like to express my thanks to being able to associate myself with something containing the word youth. It doesn't happen very often these days for reasons that escape me, but it certainly feels good. Having first come to China in January 1972, when I was actually young, China for me is always associated with my youth, and it makes me feel young when I come here. So thank you. Now, the main theme, I hope nobody will be surprised if I interpret the title, the rather grand title, the Geostrategic Rebalancing of the Asia-Pacific and World Order, as really being about the rise of China. Of course it is. That's why we're here. I mean, other countries are important, other things are going on, but the big story is the rise of China, and I take that as axiomatic. Recently, an influential foreign policy commentator in Australia said, you know, we need to stop talking so much about China, we need to be thinking about all the other countries in the region, all the other things that are going on. And that's true, but when we talk to the other countries, what do we talk about? We talk about China. The fact is, of course, we shouldn't be surprised by the rise of China. I mean, the surprising thing is it's taken this long. You know, because for most of the past 2,000 years, China's accounted for something like 22–33% of global GDP. And if you add India to that, or the agglomeration of civilizations and states that make up what we now know as India, it would come to over 50%. So it's the last 150 years that have been anomalous, that have been atypical, due to the Industrial Revolution, first in Britain, and then Western, followed by Japanese imperialism, some seriously bad political choices in China itself, coupled with a pattern of dynastic decline. But we're now seeing a return to global normality, and we'd better think how we readjust to it. I was going to say adjust to it, readjust to it. You know, since the commencement of China's program of opening reform in late 1978, progress really has been striking. You all know the story. Millions of people, literally millions of people, have been lifted out of poverty. Personal freedoms have greatly expanded. Now, I'm not talking about political democracy here. I'm talking about personal freedoms, the ability of people to control their own lives, to make important choices about what really matters to them. A more prosperous and open China than we've seen for a long time. And this progress has certainly been reflected in the international era. We're looking at China well removed, I think, from the dreams of Chairman Mao, with all due respect, but one perhaps that would ironically have gladdened the hearts of many of the left-wing KMT nationalists of the 1930s and 1940s. I think the current Mingguo is not entirely accidental. But having said that, China is still a developing country and will be for some time to come, maybe quite a long time to come. There are large areas of excellence, we're right here in the middle of one, and far larger areas of poverty, weakness. There are several quite different Chinas. There's a 21st century China, an early to mid-20th century China, and other areas of China's vast landmass at still earlier stages of development. China contains some of the most sophisticated, switched on and wired people on Earth, a considerable number of whom are in this room right now. And of course this is a small minority taken in terms of China's overall population. With a population of 1.3 billion, a small minority is actually still a hell of a lot of people, as we in Australia need to remind ourselves. But there are also hundreds of millions who are anything but that. You know, back in 2005, which wasn't so long ago, there were still some 204 million people living on less than $1.25 a day, US dollars. Problems, again, you're aware of them. They're multiple, domestic and international, but I'm sure it's the domestic issues that are most likely to keep China's leaders awake at night. You know the story. Corruption, protests and disturbances, serious polarization of wealth between West and East, polarization of wealth within the cities, dreadful pollution, you know, 25,000 new cars hitting the roads every day, 16 out of 20 of the world's most polluted cities, 90% of all rivers seriously polluted, shortage of energy resources. Of course, energy has an international impact as well. Vulnerability to natural disasters, which of course we saw tragically in Sichuan not so long ago, issues with minorities, HIV/AIDS, an aging population, the stark gender imbalance, and so on. And at the same time, I'd argue there is also a spiritual crisis, or if you prefer, a crisis of values, with any number of things seeking to fill the not by bread alone gap. From one loopy extreme, Falun Gong, to the more serious, renewed interest in traditional culture, Christian and even more notable Buddhist revivals, some more questionable phenomena such as almost unbelievable levels of materialism and consumerism, and sometimes some things which are frankly alarming, like more extreme forms of nationalism. And then in the background, there's the continued and growing need for political reform, which keeps on getting pushed back, but will need to be addressed sooner or later. And in that context, the remarks made by Premier Wen Jiabao in Shenzhen recently are quite interesting. Now, all this makes China a very difficult place to govern, and it's made worse by the fact that rumours to the contrary notwithstanding, China is not actually a totalitarian country. If there was one word I would like to ban in discussions about China, it is that word totalitarian. We don't say it much in Australia. There are one or two silly people who do. It's used rather more in the United States and elsewhere. And it's completely inappropriate. Certainly if by this we mean that somehow the writ of Beijing is the command of the country as a whole. And given that the current leadership, I would argue, is pretty good, and they're certainly advised by some very, very clever people indeed, we might wish that China was actually more totalitarian than it actually is. But as they say here in Beijing, policies no sooner emerge from the Xinhua Mer, Zhongnanhai, and they start to change. So China certainly is a one-party state, but it's an authoritarian state, if you like, but it's a fragmented authoritarianism with serious challenges of governance and policy implementation. In foreign policy terms, what this means is, because China faces this range of domestic issues, that China does indeed want a stable international environment with as few unwanted distractions as possible. For us in Australia, and I think in the world generally, that's good news. And for Australia, particularly good news is that China, by and large, wants a constructive and stable relationship with the United States. And that's really the big issue when we're looking at this theme that we're discussing this morning. Of course, it's by no means an easy relationship on either side. And just look at the last few months. Things could go wrong, but we'd all better hope that they don't. And certainly for Australia, the China-US relationship is the most important relationship of any other two countries in shaping our strategic circumstances. And any Australian in his or her right mind should hope that the relationship between China and the US is in good rather than bad shape. And for now, anyway, I'd argue that notwithstanding various problems, we can still afford to be cautiously optimistic. This is, of course, helped for the time being, at least, by the change for the better in cross-strait relations. Although it's possible that the good times have now peaked because Ma Ying-jeou's popularity and that of the Kuomintang are not recovering and elections are beginning to loom. But despite the positive elements in the overall picture, neither China nor we in Australia can relax. I mean, most countries want peace and stability and so on, but they want them on their own terms, which will not always be our terms. And the way in which they and we define our core interests are unlikely always to be in harmony, to use a couple of terms which are being used a great deal at the moment. Think of differences about how to handle the Korean Peninsula. I've mentioned recent strains between China and the US, including over the South China Sea, which also involves the interests of other regional states. Relations with Japan are in a category of their own, as we all know. Relations with other major and rising, the other major and rising Asian power, India, are also set to remain complicated. The things we've been speaking of course, have an immediate and direct impact on India, including China's concern about its reliance on Middle Eastern oil, and therefore maritime security in the Indian Ocean. What makes perfect sense for China sets alarm bells ringing in India. Water problems, where action taken by China on the Tibetan plateau can seriously impact on India, Bangladesh, and for that matter, China's good friend Pakistan. And that's without considering the India-China border issues. And while we're on the subject of water, we also need to think about the ramifications of developments concerning the Lansang or Mekong River system for China's relations with Southeast Asia. And then again, on the broader issue of borders, and this is a note primarily for the Australians here, just think what it must be like for foreign policy makers to have shared land borders with 14 other countries.